So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the afternoon session of the Netnod technical meeting. The time has gone 1:30, so if you could please take your seats. Just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notices. First of all, just out of my own personal curiosity, could you put your hands up if you will attend the social this evening? That's a full show of hands. Excellent. Very good. So buses leave at 5:45 outside here. There will be buses taking you to the venue. There won't be buses bringing you back from the venue, so you might have to make alternate arrangements. I hope that's okay. If there are any of you wavering and not sure whether to come, it's going to be located in the same building as the ABBA Museum. So all I'm saying, take a chance on me, Mamma Mia, it's going to be great. So buses 5:45 this evening. We're going to begin this afternoon's session with Jan Nygren. From 1994 to 1996, Jan was Minister for Coordination in the Swedish government. He has held positions as State Secretary of Civil Affairs and the State Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, as well as being Vice President of Saab and Chairman of the Board of the Swedish Defence Material Administration. He is currently chairman of the steering committee at the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences, and today we'll talk about the effects of digitalization. So please join me in welcoming Jan to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you so much for inviting me to this event. As you will soon realize, I think I belong to the same group that Jon told us that he belongs to, which means that I am not an expert. I'm not an expert in anything, to be honest with you. But as you could hear from the short presentation of me, now you know my name and you know part of my background. Which means that I've been in politics for a long time. I've been in the private sector for quite a long time. I'm not going to tire you with more of what I have done during lifetime, because long CVs only sort of tells you one thing, and that is that you are getting old. The reason why I'm here is, of course, the connection or the relation with IVA. And Ingenjörsvetenskapsakademin in Swedish stands for, in English, Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Science. And this is one of the oldest engineering science academies, turning 100 next year. And like Patrik Feldström, who you will hear from next, I'm a member of the academy. The mission of this academy is to highlight issues that are important for society, often those related to research and technology, to explore them and propose measures that sort of generally benefit all of Sweden. And the academy have always carefully safeguarded our independence, and politicians and others are therefore rather keen to listen to and discuss issues with us. One can say that this academy have so far a little bit of a better reputation than another academy that I don't want to mention this time. So right now I'm chairing a project called Digitalization for Increased Competitiveness. And Patrik is also involved in this project, and I guess that he has a finger in having me here. Thank you for that. If I say something that you like and is positive, please talk to me. If there is some objections, you can always talk to Patrik. The projects, the steering committee is composed of members from many different areas of society, and this steering committee is, of course, important, but perhaps even more important is the work carried out by the 40 or so people who are members of the project's 3 work groups. Their task is to delve deep into the project's 3 main topics, and they are digital infrastructure, which Patrik is heading, and The second is the need for competence in this area, and the third is integrity. And the project started just over a year ago and will end in March next year. And now we start to see where our analysis is leading and what type of proposal we might present. And I just want to use a few minutes of your time to elaborate around some of the possible conclusions and questions that are up in the air in this project. There will be no slides. You will probably recognize this as a lecture from one of your old professors. The reason why is not only that I might be a little bit lazy, but since the project is halfway through, a little bit more than halfway through, I would like to sort of present some thoughts. But the conclusions, the real conclusions, will be taken later on by the 3 working groups and the steering group. And I do not want to leave too much of ballpoints and shorts after me, because there will be reports, as I said, seminars and so on, when the job is sort of carried out fully. This project is introduced by EVA itself, like any other projects that EVA is working with. There is no one that has ordered it. We have no customer that is paying us. The project, like all the projects from EVA, is sort of formed by EVA, the academy itself, because EVA think there is a need for it. And the reason for it, I don't think that I need to tell you that. I'll come back to that later on. But it's important to say that this is the academy itself have taken the initiative, and the target for the result is probably not you. It's decision makers of different kind in politics, business, and otherwise. We would be very happy if you, who have quite a good knowledge, I guess, about what we are discussing, would agree upon what we come to. But I think that most of what I'm going to say is probably something that you might already know. Anyhow, one important aspect of our project is to sort of demystify the concept of digitalization. Quite simply, we want to identify and describe the fantastic opportunities that are offered, but also recognize that we as a society must be able to manage the risks and tackle the problems involved in order to take full advantage of this opportunity. We see digitalization as one in a series of industrial revolutions, and I'm not going to count them up because you know that. And we now see a structural transformation driven by digitalization based on new possibilities to rapidly process and use large quantities of data, especially with new technologies such as AI. This is fascinating, but not particularly mysterious. One key issue for Sweden is how we should use digitalization to increase our competitiveness. And we are focused on competitiveness because it is a matter of survival for Sweden. We are a small, open economy, and the fact that we progressed from being one of Europe's poorest countries at the end of the 18th century to one of the wealthiest today is mainly, at least, explained by our success in becoming more competitive compared to the rest of the world. We did this by being good at research and innovation, and this resulted in fantastic Swedish companies such as Ericsson, Saab, Volvo, IKEA, and so on. I know there are other companies that are more into that type of business than you are, but this is history. So that's why I'm mentioning these companies. We are facing a great challenge. That is probably something that you also know. In a short space of time, many of our social services have become digital and dependent on an efficient internet connection. And meanwhile, we have deregulated the expansion of the digital infrastructure. In past, Televerket, for example, controlled telephony, cables and operation and communication systems, etc. Those of you who are from Sweden probably knows, even if you are a little bit younger than those of us who really remember Televerket. At that time, the communication infrastructure was organized in the form of a silo model. And I think that you probably recognize the picture. The deregulation of the telecom market has, however, resulted in a situation where different actors are responsible for different parts and level of the system. We call this the lasagne model. Meat, sauce, etc., layered between sheets of pasta. Lasagne has multiple layers, but when we eat it, as all of us who love lasagne knows, each bite creates a whole experience. That could be good and bad, but still, it creates an experience that is sort of kept together. The problem is that the way in which we are controlling and coordinating digital infrastructure in many respects still resembles a silo model. Responsibility at the national government level is divided between different ministers and different ministries. Many of our public agencies and authorities are doing excellent work addressing issues relating to digital infrastructure, but coordinating between them is based more on good individual initiatives than on organized cooperation. Many politicians and decision makers understand far too little about the vulnerability of the system. And I might be able to say that since I have spent at least 30 years of my life in politics. And we see this is a big problem, a real big problem. And this could be one of the reasons for the absence of better coordination and or vice versa. The lack of coordination could, in fact, also lead to a lot of mistakes and wrong decisions. So what is the best way to coordinate and control digitalization? Well, without going into details, we believe that the government needs a coordination function with the power to act to fill the void that exists today in mainly three areas. There are probably more. First, the government should be responsible for coordination and prioritization of the expansion of all parts of Sweden and Sweden's digital infrastructure. This means working with government agencies, county councils and municipalities, and not least the private sector, of course. Note that I'm not talking about control, but about coordination and creating the necessary conditions and thereby ensuring that we have a robust infrastructure to meet the needs of a digitalized society. It is important to make sure that the various control mechanisms that exist are used in the right way. We need to propose the right combinations of legislation, oversight and public procurement to improve the digital infrastructure. The second area is overall responsibility for ensuring that there are common standards and platforms on which the basic systems and applications are built. Roughly speaking, this is about the technical core of digitalization. It can perhaps be compared to the water supply and everything that happens from the water works until the water reaches our taps. The equipment we have in our bathroom or kitchen is another matter. The third area involves overall responsibility for infrastructure and basic systems for cybersecurity. In other words, issues of national security. Asking the average Swede about this, he or she would probably think and answer that, isn't all this in place? You probably know better. It is not. Efforts are being made to address all of these issues today within different agencies and organizations in a sort of bottom-up process, where each agency is doing a good job based on its own capacity and knowledge. But there is no coordination, at least too little. In particular, there is no organized effort in terms of people in different agencies and organizations who are focusing on similar issues and who could be meeting and agreeing on ways to use their shared knowledge, so that we as a society could benefit more from their work. Relationship with the private sector could and should of course also be developed much more. It is a strange experience to have met so many people from different areas in this field who never have talked to each other, never met each other, never have had a chance to discuss with each other on possible development strategies. And I'm talking about people from the government, from PTS, from MSB, from agencies, and from the private sector. We have in IVA sort of tried to organize that kind of meeting places, and that have been very positive. But one sad experience of that is that everybody witnesses that this is something rare. It never happens otherwise, unfortunately. The project is, of course, also focusing on the issue of integrity. And the reason is simple. If we as a society want to exploit all of digitalization's possibilities, our citizens must have confidence in the systems and applications. When we use a service, our experience must be that it meets our standards for integrity. We need look no further than the companies that offer services based on individual level data to see that there is a serious imbalance in this market. Companies such as Facebook and Google are entirely dependent on us as individuals, giving them access to information. There are brand new business models and to some extent new markets where the rules of game are somewhat and sometimes unclear. And the big companies also have monopoly, and competitors do not have access to the same amount of data as they have. And this situation raises a series of questions relevant to the integrity discussion. One question is about open data. Today, companies and government authorities are able to monopolize access to their basic data, but this should not be taken for granted. A desirable development could be more companies and organizations getting access to this basic data. Maybe only the applications that are trade secret, so to say, should be protected by copyright, patents, and so on. And the question is whether we can and should try to regulate this, or if the market will manage it alone. I hope that we might be able to answer that question, but it's still open. Second, anonymous data. We look at data collection and data management from an individual's perspective. We assume that it's possible to keep data anonymous. But it could be said that there is no anonymous data. We must at least ask ourselves what we mean by anonymous data. By connecting, using substantial processing capacity, and by combining different data volume sources and registers, we can turn anonymous data into information where it's possible to trace individuals. The question is what we can regulate and what we need to do to guarantee personal integrity. While working on the integrity issue, we have also noted how far we have come from the FRA, you know, the National Defense Radio Establishment debate. I guess you remember it, with its emphasis on the absolute integrity of individual. If we just look at how we behave on social media, it's clear that what we are willing to put out about ourselves varies greatly depending on the digital context. One outcome of the work we are doing within the project will likely be proposals on a number of points of departure, if I may say so, for a continued focus on the integrity issue, especially at the political level. Some of these are the way we view individual integrity in the age of digitalization cannot be absolute. It must depend on the context the individual is in and what he or she prioritizes. This is similar to what we choose to talk about and how much we reveal about ourselves, depending on whether we are with our immediate family or at work or any other place. The integrity, second, of the individual is linked to the fact that we are citizens in a society and how anonymous we can be allowed to be. In Sweden, it's not possible to be completely anonymous. We need to have a personal identity number, and that system is used to create better social services. At least it was meant so. Digitalization poses new questions about the information the authorities have about us as individuals based on new ways of analyzing large amounts of data that digitalization makes possible. The integrity discussion needs to take place, bearing in mind aspects such as changes in security systems. If we do not believe that future solutions may help solve the integrity issue, there is a risk that we will prevent research and innovation from happening. And that would be a serious problem for a country like Sweden, where our prosperity is based on research and innovation. We believe that it is extremely important for people to have confidence in the opportunities offered by digitalization and our ability as a society to manage these effects. Raising levels of trust and confidence is both a task for politicians, but also for the private sector and for us as individuals. We are also focusing on all aspects of the need for increased competence in this area. This is, of course, a key issue, and we will be emphasizing both the need for digital technology specialists, where I can see some in this room, an area where Sweden has large shortcomings, unfortunately, I have to say, and the need for broad digital expertise. Of course. Another important question is what type of knowledge and awareness managers and leaders need to have in order to lead in the era of digitalization. And digitalization is not, as you probably know, only a technology issue. It is a transition that is affecting all of society, and it cannot and should, of course, not be avoided or stopped. It is a powerful force driving change based on fantastic technical solutions that are constantly being renewed. But if we as a society are to properly benefit from it, it is essential that those of us working on these issues understand the need to consider the technical opportunities in relations to how they will affect society and single individuals. To take advantage of the opportunities, we must also pay attention to the problems and risks. And I want to believe that we now, just as during past major changes in society, can influence our own future. If you sometimes listen to radio and news and read social media, you might hesitate to that sentence, but I still think that we can influence our own future. And these are the opportunities our project intends to highlight. We hope to be able sort of to spark a wide-ranging, important and continued debate. We will probably, no, not probably, we will not be able to answer all the questions, but we can point at some important questions, try to find some answers and some, as I said, to spark, hopefully spark a wide-ranging and continued debate. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jan. We have time for a couple of quick questions if anyone has any. Can we have the microphone in the front here, please?
Hello. Yeah. Sir, my name is Jörgen Städje, journalist. You went very quickly over the question of education. I mean, that's something you really have to address, because the level of education in Sweden today is what goes against all that you're fighting for, like, well, engineering. Today in Swedish schools, digital technology, physics, chemistry is dangerous. Don't touch it. Leave it to the guys in white lab coats somewhere far away, but you know, it's dangerous. We lack good education. It's horrible to say that about Sweden, but we lack good education. I don't like to say that, but you know, kids are so good with computers today, you know, they can point to their mobile phones. Great. It's not technology. It's guys like Feldström over there, he knows about technology, but Swedish schools need a great injection of technology, technical knowledge. This is horrible. And it seems like no one is really interested. We have lots of politicians, I know, they talk a lot, but they're not interested in education. And Sweden is based on education. You name ASEA, you name IKEA, you name Saab. They're all based on educated people. And we're losing out because schools are so bad and because people are not interested.
Sorry.
It's horrible. Sorry. Okay.
That's more of a comment than a question. Would you want to respond?
No, I have only one comment. If you should measure the length of different parts of my speech, then it's, of course, I had 3 sentences on security and national security. Of course, education is extremely important, and 1 out of 3 working groups are dealing with this, and will also publish, of course, a lot of hopefully a lot of suggestions, and I share your criticism. I definitely do, and I was a bit concentrated a bit on the question of coordination, because I think that we now have a possibility to influence, because we are sort of expecting sooner or later, maybe later, a new government. So that is the reason why we have sort of a little bit made a priority around that, but that does not necessarily means that we don't think that education is a question not worth discussing. On the contrary, I have nothing. I agree with you. We try to see if we can find some good solutions on the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Could you join me again in thanking Jan for his talk? So the next speaker today is a man who doesn't need any introduction. It's Patrick Folström, Technical Director of Netnod. Patrick.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about key management in 2 specific areas. They're not very much related to each other, but I was asked, well, why don't you just talk about both of them and we'll get done with it. So I'm going to talk about key management in DNS and key management in NTP. And the reason why I talk about it is, of course, that we at Netnod deal with both of these. Both are headaches in their own specific ways. So if we start with DNS, So some basics about DNSSEC for those who doesn't really know. How many people in here have a zone that they have signed? Okay, that's good. How many of you are running a resolver that you think is validating DNSSEC signed responses? Okay, that's good. How many in the room do run resolvers that you don't know whether they're validating or not? Okay, good, excellent. So maybe this is good. Anyways, so the whole idea is, of course, like with any kind of information that we use digital signatures, normally we have asymmetric encryption. We have a private key that is kept secret, that is used for signing the information, and then we have a public key that is published in the DNS. So we use the DNS itself to distribute the public key, which is kind of clever, or complicated, or stupid, depending on how you look at it. But anyways, that's what we're doing. And the way things fit together is that we take the hash of the public key in a zone that is used in the zone, and we pass that hash to the parent zone. And the parent zone then signs the hash. And that's how we create the PKI. So you can validate the key. Let's see here. So you can validate the signature on a record by checking the public key for the key that have been signing the record itself, and then the records sign each other, including that in the parent zone, the parent zone's private key is signing the hash of the key in the child zone. So you get a hierarchy like this. And this then is used to do validation, just like any kind of PKI, by having some kind of trust anchor. There must be something ultimately that we trust. And one of the more and here in Sweden, just because we started signing things in DNS as the first TLD in the world, the first thing that we trusted were the public key for .se. But since a couple of years back, we can trust the key that is used for the root zone. So most validators that are validating things in DNS do trust the public portion of the key that is used to sign the root zone at the top. And the whole idea with doing this, of course, is that you should not look things up by using DNS. You need to have some kind of mechanism to get the key to be able to trust it, so you don't base your trust on something that someone managed to do with some injection on some false information. So we can trust any key we want, but we have chosen to try to build the DNSSEC PKI on trusting the key for the key signing key for the root zone. And every validating resolver must have a trust anchor configured. This can be configured manually, or it can automatically be updated with the help of a standard called RFC 5011. What this RFC says is that, in a little bit simplistic ways, we use the existing key that we trust to validate that the next key is correct. So by trusting the existing key, we will trust the next key, which could be viewed as a little bit of cheating. But this also means that almost all validating resolvers today can do a replacement of the current trust anchor by trusting it to introduce the next one. The negative part of dealing with change of a trust anchor this way is, of course, if we do not trust the current key, which, for example, if it got sort of stolen or leaked or something, in that case, we cannot use that mechanism to introduce the next key, because if we don't trust the current one, how would we trust the next one that is introduced by the key that we don't trust? But anyways, RFC 5011 is something that is sort of good thing when we're going to do a planned change of the validating trust anchor. So one thing that we have never done for the root, but we did it for .se a couple of times, is that we have never changed the trust anchor for the root zone. Never, ever. We started assigning the root zone with one key, and that is what we have been using. It is actually, on the other hand, quite good to know that the trust anchor for the root zone for the DNS might change, because, well, there were some people in the room here, maybe they were lying, I don't know, that said you don't really know whether your resolver is actually doing validation or not. It's actually a pretty good thing to know. And from my personal perspective, one of the best ways of educating operational people that they have things that might break is to forcefully break things for them if they have not done things correctly. Okay? So I think that we should roll the key in a planned way by introducing a new key by trusting the existing one, which is using RFC 5011. Just by doing that, we will learn that the trust anchor might change. But note that this process that we are using is not something we can use for emergency roll. Don't mix these two things up. We are only doing this so we can roll the key if we change the crypto algorithm, if we change the key length, or if we are just sort of testing what to do. But anyways, by changing the trust anchor, everyone operating a resolver will, if nothing else, learn where the validating resolvers are. So let's try to do this, like today. So we're actually going to change, the key is going to be rolled at 6 p.m. today for the first time in the world. I think that around 6 p.m. today, all of us will be in buses or already at the party. My secret plan was actually to, hopefully we were going to roll the key before 6 p.m. so we would suddenly turn off the lights in this room or something to see how many people were screaming. But on the other hand, it's not exactly 6 p.m. because propagation time of zones and other kind of thing. So it's sort of 6 p.m.-ish. So anyways, so this is basically you have another 4 hours. You have another 4 hours to go to all your resolvers and validate that your resolvers have already sucked in the new incoming key. Okay? Because the incoming key has already been published for quite some time, several months, or at least the last month. I don't actually remember. I'm looking at Johan. Johan, how long time is it? A month? More? 6 months? Lehman? More than a year. Okay. So for more than a year, the incoming key has been published. So if you have a resolver that has done the right thing according to RFC 5011, it should already have the new key installed. If not, validation will not really work after 6 p.m. So I have a web page. You see the link there. We also, Netnod, yesterday evening, posted in social media also a text with that link, which tells you how you can validate and check whether the new incoming key has been sucked up by your validating resolver. I actually myself, being a good person, I checked my Unbound server at home. And of course, what I discovered was that I was using a little bit too old Debian. And in the Debian distribution for information, the version of Unbound is so old, so this cannot be used. Okay? And the instructions from Unbound is then you download and upgrade and do whatever, kill a duck or a chicken or something, whatever. Anyways, but it is possible to, you cannot really ask this query to sort of old versions of Unbound, but then by doing some, like kicking it in the back, I managed to get my resolvers to do the right thing. So check this, please. 3 hours and 58 minutes. So today, we're doing this for the first time in history. So let's hope that all of us that run DNS resolvers actually can have a fun time tonight and that you do not have to be on the phone. Okay. Any questions on this? And we have several people in the room here, including Lehman and Johan, of course, that do this much more operational than me, even though I do operational maybe more than them in certain corners. There are many other people that know DNS in the room from all of you here. Thank you very much for coming. So talk to each other and let's ensure that this actually works smoothly. Sweden is the country in the world where we have most validation in the world. Over 90% of the DNS queries are validated, so if something is happening, it will be here in Sweden. Let's take this first. Comments on this one? Yeah, that was a surprise. Sorry for not really synchronizing with the microphone
Hello?
carriers.
Okay. So I have a comment that I discovered last year. If you have an image of a resolver that you did a year and a half ago, and you then spin it up in a month, the new key will not be there. You cannot suck down the new key based on 2-year-old key. That information will be gone. So if this is how you deploy things, you need to respin that image and update the key. Because in a month, if I understand correctly, the new key will be the only key.
No, after 6 p.m. today, it will be the only key.
No, but it will not be... Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, you're absolutely correct. The old key will still be there, but after 6 p.m., the old key will not be used to sign stuff.
Correct.
That is correct.
But I think you can, for 30 more days, you can still suck down the new key because it's still, like the old key is still valid, if I understand. Okay. Anyhow, if in December you spin up an image that only has the old key, it will not work. So I think this is an important operational consideration that for people. Then it's also, I discovered personally, since I configured DNSSEC back when we started doing this in 2007 or whatever, I had new bind, but old config that did not update the key. So I didn't have to update my bind, but I have to fix my configuration, which is another point that you can run a very recent version of the code, but if you haven't updated your configuration, then you might still be in trouble.
That's absolutely correct. And to express what you just said in a different way, just to see whether I understand you, all your configurations and all your operating, running resolvers must have done RFC 5011 handshake between a year ago or more and now. Okay. So let's have fun tonight. The rest of the people can download SSH clients and whatever on your cell phones because you might need it. Göran Marby, CEO of ICANN, was commenting on me and Lehman and the Internet Stiftelsen today and said, yes, I'm going to make the order, sign the document, and then I will write about it in social media, how good everything is. And my comment was, of course, if you can. Next thing, NTS. This is basically what a clock is doing. A clock is doing two things. You have something that ticks, and you have something that counts the number of ticks. Not so difficult. The problem, though, are of course, to keep track of the phase of the ticking is actually happening according to what is agreed to, both the distance in time between the ticks and when the tick is happening. Both of them should be correct. And if you talk about the number of ticks, the difficulty is, of course, when you turn on the clock. At what number should you start count with? So you're not off by 1 error or something. So what you want to have is, you want to have both good accuracy and good precision. And this is something like Ellen told this morning that we are very happy that we actually, at Netnod, the NTP and PTP service that we're running, we're actually better in both accuracy and precision than what we expected. Thank you very much, Ragge, Nick, and everyone else that works with the NTP project. Really well done. So, both of them. And I showed pictures like this. This is an old picture. We should produce new pictures that explains a little bit more what the node actually looks like, but basically consists of multiple different things. But as we all know, NTP, well, not all of us know. If everyone knew this, I would not have to tell everyone. But NTP is UDP-based protocol, and we know that you can very easily send UDP packets with whatever kind of content or whatever kind of sender address that you want. So it's very easy to lie. And that means that people might lie regarding NTP. So what about signed NTP? This is something that exists in the NTP standard, but the people that wrote the signed NTP standard, they were basically not crypto people. They were probably crypto people like me, but they were not crypto people. So the handshake of what key to use for the actual transaction was basically not useful. So the only signed NTP version of the protocol that is possible to use is something that uses symmetric keys. You have the same secret in both ends. We at Netnod, we have implemented signed NTP in the FPGAs that we have. And anyone that wants to talk NTP with us and have signed NTP, contact us, and we do an out-of-band in an envelope or something, PGP, exchange of keys that we then use for the NTP. But of course, this doesn't really scale. We can handle a couple of tens of thousands of keys, but then it doesn't really work. So we need to have a version of NTP where we can negotiate what secret to use in the actual NTP transaction. And this is where the MTS proposal comes into place. In the IETF, people have been working on TS for quite some time. And unfortunately, there are two camps, or even more than two camps, that could not really agree on how to do things. So what we decided to do at Netnod on request by PTS, that it asks us to run time and frequency, we spent some energy on looking into the current NTS proposal, and we saw that, well, wait a second, by doing some slight tweaks, we can actually come up with a version of NTS that is implementable, that we believe works, and also that the various camps actually can agree to. We submitted that in the summer, and it seems to be the case that we have some movement here, that people actually agree on how to do this. Partly, of course, this is not our fault, or thanks to Netnod. It was also probably about the right time, because people got tired over not having a proper version of NTP. So maybe it was just that people got tired. They didn't have energy to continue to fight. So we have a new version of the NTS proposal. Draft IETF NTP using NTS for NTP 13 is the current version. The interesting thing here is that what we did, which is also the NTS proposal itself, from the beginning, not our invention, is that we have a separate NTS key establishment protocol, which is using standard TLS 1.3, and you negotiate a cookie that is then used in the actual NTP transaction. So that is the first step. And then we have more or less a normal NTP protocol, but we use some extension fields to pass the cookie between the client and the server. The next important thing is that it is completely stateless from the server side, because we don't want the NTP server to keep state of the clients. So all the state of the communication between the client and the server on the NTP level is managed is in the client side. So one can say that it is a Kerberos-like three-party negotiation using TLS and NTP, where the state is kept in the client. It makes sense? Okay, good. Whew, at least some people nodded. Maybe it's because you just want to be nice to me. Anyways, beat me up afterwards. So anyways, so this means that for the NTP service, which is where all the load is, we can basically use ordinary NTP with symmetric key encryption. What we already do, what we at Netnod has implemented, what we know works. So all the overhead with the asymmetric key exchange is something that is done on the server side. In the separate new protocol, we'll do the handshake. Much better than the old NTP thing. What else is new? Well, another thing that we did at Netnod is that because no one else has really large-scale experience of running NTP servers in Anycast deployments, we also ensure that the protocol can handle unicast, key exchange, and Anycast NTP servers. So this must also, not only a three-party handshake, and this is one of the reasons why it's important that the state is kept in the client, because you might send two different NTP queries to the same IP address, but you end up on two different NTP servers. So you have this kind of state machines. The KE server, you have the NTP servers, you have the client that negotiate. The parameters receive the initial cookie, and then you talk with any of the NTP servers in the Anycast pool. High-level interaction. So this text is not so much, it's a wall of text, not fun to talk about. I already told about all this, but I wanted this to be in the documentation that you can download. This is what I think the key thing extracted directly from the internet draft for those who are interested. And the same thing for the NTP protocol, that the NTP server, as I said, is using the cookie to recover the key material in the initial response. And then the response includes a fresh encrypted cookie that the client then uses in the next step. So as I said, very, very important that the all the state is in the client, and a constant refreshing of cookies to handle replay attacks, the car key problem. So what is the status? Well, we hope from Netnod's side that people now agree on this. We heard from a couple of vendors that we are in contact with that they are even interested in implementing this, even if the IETF stalls and that people, individuals in the IETF don't want to move this forward. We intend to finish this internet draft and to implement NTS, both the server portions, the KE server, and also the NTP protocol, both as a standalone thing, and then also, of course, work on the FPGA. And this is part of the time and frequency project, and already in the original request from PTS that we should ensure that the protocol evolves. We have not had time and resources within the project to deal with this yet, but 2019 is when we will deal with this. So all of those of you who are interested in the evolution of NTP and not only using our services, make sure that we know who you are. We know who some of you are already, but if you're interested and have not heard from us, contact us and we'll make sure that you end up being involved. Thank you very much. Any questions on that?
So we have time for some questions for Patrick on the key rollover or NTS. Anything?
Just speak.
Rick, I just got a message from a guy called Ulf Kristersson. He had another issue he needs to be unstuck. Can you take care of that later?
Excuse me?
I just got a message from a guy called Ulf Kristersson. He had another issue that needs to be unstuck. Can you take care of that later?
Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Path for...
A comment on that. I think just like Jan said, to be a little bit blunt on what we said on in the project that we are working on, we have this coordination that we don't see in the government, but we have a lot of organizations at the bottom that are doing a lot of good things, like everyone in this room. So we have a very, very, very efficient bottom-up process. And the question is not what this bottom-up process can do thanks to the coordination up there, but what we can do even though we have a non-coordination up there. Right, John? Yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. So we have the last speaker of this session before the coffee break. The speaker is Jonas Leon. He has more than 17 years of experience working in cybersecurity. His areas of expertise include advanced cybersecurity operations related to red teaming, cryptography, programming, SIGINT, penetration testing, and computer forensics. He is the senior cybersecurity specialist at Triop, and today we'll talk about new adventures in the cybersecurity landscape. So please welcome Jonas to the stage.
Oh, thank you. Thanks you for having me. Either I can do my talk or I can do some beatboxing, if you would like. Would you like to hear my talk? I do some beatboxing first. Let's see if I can. Okay? Yeah. Perfect. Now, over to some more serious stuff. Anyone here playing Fortnite? Hands up if you're playing Fortnite. No one? Oh, one. This is actually a screenshot from the computer game Fortnite. And my son, he was reaching out for me, and he was like, "Oh, Dad, you can get a free dance in Fortnite." And I was like, "A free dance? What?" I was reading, and verify your email and enable 2FA. I was like, "Okay, yeah, sure, I should enable two-factor authentication." And so he got his free dance, and his Epic Games account is even more secure now. And what I would like to say about this is it's something I've been talking about for many years, and it's computer security or security combined with gamification. And I think it's I know some other games are also doing this, and I think MailChimp. They also have some discount on your account if you're enabling two-factor authentication. So this is really good and something that we should use and try to implement in more areas in the field. Yeah, over to some more serious stuff. Yeah, my name is Jonas Lejon, and most of my time I've been working at some agencies, FRA and Försvarsmakten, the Swedish Armed Forces. But since 4 years, I've been doing consulting in my own company called Triop. I'm also a member of the board at IIS and doing some advisory board work and also blogging at kryptera.se, this place. So if you would like, you can sponsor me with Patreon from $1 each month, so you can support my blogging. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today is trying to predict some of the future and see what the trends are there, what's happening within the cybersecurity field, and what can we see, what movements are there in the areas. There's also, you know, people talking about advanced persistent threat, APTs and stuff like that, and even you might heard of the super microservers with the implants, hardware implants, and everyone is saying, oh, it's the Chinese, but is it really the Chinese? I mean, attribution is quite hard in this field, and as discussing is, it's probably more politics behind than cybersecurity. But I will get into more about this later on. So what are the trends and what are we seeing? I should say that what I'm talking about here is both from my personal experience, it's from research, from Symantec, for example, it's from Trend Micro, it's from FireEye and different companies, and the source is also stated. So each year we see more and more groups using more and more 0 days, and I think Stuxnet, that was public known about 2010, used about 6 different 0 days, and I think it was an eye-opener for many people to see that, okay, there's malware and it's using 0 days. If you know what 0 days, it's vulnerabilities are known by the vendor, not fixed though. So each year we're seeing about 7% more and more 0 days being used by malware or different types of groups using. What we're also seeing is more and more false flag operation. So when we're doing malware research and looking at different types of malware, we're seeing that they're trying to plant different types of, they're pointing the fingers or they're pointing the evidence in some direction, but it's not always that it's accurate. Because, you know, the attribution is quite hard and it's not always as people say, oh, it's the Chinese trying to hack us or it's the Russians, but it could also be a false flag operation, and it's something also that we see more and more. In the beginning, for example, Stuxnet, people looked at the timestamps, for example, when was the different modules compiled and what timestamps was in the header, and we're trying to like look at, okay, what time zones are the guys writing this code? Are they writing from left to right or right to left and stuff like that? And that's also something we see more and more. What's also interesting is the use of dual-use tools. That's what's meaning with that is tools that can be used both for legit administration work, I mean like SSH, and other tools like TeamViewer, for example, that organizations tend to use, and also what the bad guys are using. It's also called something called living off the land, where the attacker is only using tools and stuff that's already into the system or the operating system, and not introducing new binaries, for example. And it makes it harder for the antivirus software to keep up. One example that I mentioned here is PowerShell, for example. We see a 267% increase of malware using PowerShell, and it's more and more antivirus vendors are keeping up and getting better at the detection. PowerShell, for example, and other scripting languages, I should say, because Windows, for example, support various scripting languages. WMI and MSI. MSI is packages, and WMI is Windows Management Instrumentation. that also has been recent years has been more and more used by malware and different types of groups. And also something that we see is less targets, because the malware is getting more and more unique. So, for example, if the bad guys are targeting one organization, the binary or the target is the packages is quite unique for just one target. Also, something that we see is that more and more malware is getting signed. I remember some of the parts of Stuxnet was also signed, and what's signed is that there's this. I think there was stolen certificates from what vendor was it? Anyone remember what vendor they used? Yeah, maybe Netherlands. Yeah, somewhere. And also one thing that's been is memory only. That the malware or the never touches the disk. So if the computer is being turned off or the memory is wiped, the malware is gone. So there is no persistence and makes forensic investigations harder to do. I remember some years ago there was a lot of discussion about anti-forensics, for example, and how we should hide the malware and hide the bad stuff. But what the bad guys are doing is they just use, because the more and complex you introduce into the software, the more things you have as a forensic investigator to look at. So what malware also is doing these days is getting more and more modular. So for example, if there's a keylogger, or if there's for example, a memory scraper looking for card numbers, for example, there's a separate module for each and every one part of the malware. Something else that's quite interesting is something called situation awareness. So the infection, the malware is looking at, okay, so how is my environment looking? Are there, for example, Wi-Fi network? Are there Bluetooth devices around? Or is there an air gap? Is this network offline? Is it a military network, for example, not connected to any other network? The malware has knowledge and can use, for example, USB devices or other types of removable storage to try to evade or try to move between different networks. Or maybe call home. James mentioned the kill chain, the cyber kill chain earlier today, and something is important for malware is to do command and control and phone home and say, okay, I'm in this target, I'm in this organization, for example. So the malware, if there is an air gap network, the malware probably needs to signal or tell phone home somehow to say that, okay, I'm on this network. There's also, as I mentioned, the uniqueness of the payload. It's also, there's something called environmental keyed payload. And so I think Kaspersky discovered the first in the wild environmental keyed payload in the Middle East, because there was a path to software on the system that was the key to decrypt parts of the payload of the malware. So one of the module was had the path. So the researchers at Kaspersky, they didn't manage to find the keys, so they couldn't look at the module, what the module in the malware was doing, because they needed to have this key. And they also blogged about this, and they needed to crowdsource and get people to look at their program directory, what different types of program was there. And I think it was found at some financial institutions in the Middle East. And it's also something we've seen. Domain fronting has been was quite popular, I think, last year. But then Amazon and Google and most of the bigger CDN vendors disabled the use of so you can use domain fronting. So what domain fronting is that you're using a CDN network, and you're sending your request. So if you're looking at the metadata, or if you're looking at the packets on the network, at the TLS packets, you see the SNI field, surname identification, and you see the certificate going to one place, but the HTTP host header is pointing somewhere else within the CDN network. And Tor has also been using domain fronting in the MIC transport. I think that's why Google and Amazon disabled this functionality. But that's also something that we see, because when you're doing network forensics, looking at domain fronting traffic, it's harder to say that, okay, this is malware or this is something fishy going on the network. I should also mention supply chain security, especially in these super micro days, that it's people used to think as cyber supply chain security to software only, but it's hardware also, and it could be firmware also. And so it's the supply chain security is very broad, and something also that we see increase in attacks, that more and more software vendors getting hacked, and so the legit software is getting changed, and there's malicious payload inserted somewhere in their supply chain. So pointing fingers only at the vendor, I think it's wrong. You should look at the full chain, and that's why it's called supply chains, I think. Some other trends, cryptocurrency mining, cryptojacking, for example, we've seen a decrease actually. And probably it's because the Bitcoin prices have gone down a little bit. Also ransomware, it's a decrease, but what's increasing is that there are more and more families, different types of malware, but the infections are getting down about 30%. And I think that's quite good. And I think it was last year that we'd seen it's peaked, and now it's getting more and more less infection, which is good. But what we're seeing more and more is remote desktop protocol, remote administration, and there's about 3 million endpoints that has RDP open to the internet. And it's not really that good, and we're seeing more and more botnets and malware attacks using RDP and trying to brute force usernames and passwords, just like SSH. Also, something that we've seen is increasing Mac malware. As you see here, it's in the end of the last year, it's more and more, and the numbers behind this is that, as I mentioned earlier, more and more attacks is going from binaries to scripting, for example, Google Chrome extension and other types of extensions and scripts. And that's actually why there's an increase, because the attacks it's not specifically created for Macs. It's cross-platform malware that's increasing. So Mac is just in the following with. I should give an example also this is an example of living off the land. In this example, I'm using the tool CertUtil. It's a Windows built-in tool, CertUtil, for management certificates in Windows. And you could say it's a dual-use tool, because you can use it to download a file. In this example, I'm downloading dll.txt. It's a base64 encoded text file. And the next command I'm using is CertUtil again, using a decode. So it's just decoding the base64 encoded DLL to an TXT file to an DLL. And in the next command I'm using reg-serv32. It's executing the DLL, and the DLL contains a metapreter. It's a metasploit payload, very common. To run the payload, and we get a shell, pop a shell on this computer. So why is this interesting? Because it's using only built-in, using the CertUtil and the SRV32 tool from Windows. So it's quite hard also to, if you're doing forensics, for example, or if you're doing logging, for example, checking the logs, most people tend not to look at these logs. And many of these tools also is assigned by Microsoft. So if you're using whitelisting technologies, for example, some of these tools can be used to bypass whitelisting protection also. So I see my time is running out slowly here. So that was what I was going to say. So follow me on Twitter or email me. Thank you.
We have some time for some questions. If there are any questions for Jonas, just raise your hands. No. Okay, well, please join me in thanking Jonas again. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I've been informed that the coffee break is pretty much being set up now. So if you go, you'll be able to have an early coffee break, and then we'll reconvene here at 3:30 for an excellent final session of the Netnod technical meeting. So thank you. See you then. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's gone 3:30. If you could please kindly take your seats. For the final session of today's Netnod technical meeting, and it's a great honor to welcome to the stage Andy Bechtelsheim, the founder, chief development officer, and chairman of Arista Networks. Andy was a founder and chief system architect at Sun Microsystems, where he was responsible for industry standard server architecture. Also the founder and president of Granite Systems, a gigabit Ethernet startup acquired by Cisco in 1996. And from 1996 and 2003, he served as the VP GM of the Gigabit System business unit at Cisco that developed the Catalyst 4500 family of switches. And today, Andy is the founder, chairman, and chief development officer at Arista Networks, where he's responsible for their overall product development and technical direction. Please give a very warm welcome to Andy.
Thank you, thank you. So we are going to talk about the future here, the future of 400 gigabit. And it is something that is going to happen in a big way starting next year. So it's not that the future is not too far out here. But since it's the future, our lawyers make me put up the slide, which you won't be able to read from the back. But it basically says that whatever we are saying here has nothing to do with our business projections or financial results. And our business at the risk is subject to all the risk factors that we file on a regular basis with the SEC. And we take no, like whatever we're saying here, we're not going to update if it changes. So, done with this. What I want to talk to you about what is happening in the market, or at least what the market projections are for the 100 gig market moving to 400 gigabit, the kind of chips behind that, the optics behind that, the DWM optics in particular, then a couple of slides of the kind of products we'll do in that space. That's just a few slides because they're not announced yet. And then, what's so great about 400 gig E? Jumping right in, this is a slide from Google. It's actually dated. It's about 4 years old, but they keep telling us that their internal network demand keeps doubling every year. This may be an extreme case. The industry believes that east-west traffic in cloud data centers is growing at least 50% a year, but that's doubling every other year. This is a similar slide from Facebook. The green line on the bottom is the traffic goes out of their data center to the end users, to the internet. All the red stuff is the internal stuff, I guess, collecting all your friends and data that you're supposed to keep up with. And as you all know, this was all driven, a lot of this was driven by the invention of the smartphone 10 years ago. Billions of smartphones, millions of servers in the cloud, doing all these services that we're used to and doing every day. Then on the enterprise side, people are moving to the cloud in a big way. It's growing at 40–50% a year. And this includes, platform as a service, any kind of software as a service. And it's just a big move, certainly. Now, behind this, there are tremendous investments in capital, CapEx, at these cloud companies. These are the 4 largest American companies. Their spending has roughly doubled in the last 3 years from 20 billion to 40 billion. And this includes the data center, the servers, the storage, and the network. There's no hard data on how this breaks down, but it is believed that the network is 8% of that, plus minus. And this includes the optics, meaning everything from DWM, optical transceivers, switching, and routing. The rest is, again, compute server, storage, power stations, and so on. But what is true for sure is that as of last year, the majority of Intel servers that are being shipped are ending up in cloud data centers. So this is a very, very big change from 10 years ago, where if you look at the left of this, back in 2010, 8 years ago, maybe 10% of servers went into cloud and 90% on-premise. Last year it crossed over. And by 2021, 22, it may be 2/3 in the cloud and 1/3 on-premise, primarily large companies that can afford and justify doing their own networks. Now, where the servers go, the network follows, and this is the data center switching revenue in billions of dollars. And you can see back in 2010, 2011, the cloud was just a little slice, just like here, but it's the only thing that actually grew, right? Because the on-premise didn't really grow and essentially is flat, if not declining. Now, our fortune as a company, if you will, was that we focused on these kind of customers from the beginning. So we were part of the network that got bigger and bigger, and where resiliency and uptime and no downtime is the most important issue. We are also selling to customers in this space, but we have much less share here than in these markets where we have a leading position. And of course, what the cloud people want is more for less, more speed, more throughput, less power, less cost, more automation. And the easiest way to go faster and save money is to go faster. Ethernet speed transitions going from 10 gig to 25 or the 10 to 40 to 100 have been the driving force that improve cost performance. And I just want to show you from a pure market standpoint what this actually means. Last year, so 100 gigabit, let's start with 100 gigabit here, shipped, did I hit this pointer here? Yeah, shipped less than 1 million ports in 2016, estimated about 5 million last calendar year. This year the projection is 10 million, and this is actually not quite to scale. The projection for next year, believe it or not, is 20 million ports. So it's going from like 1 minute to 20 in 3 years, the fastest increase of any Ethernet kind of technology. In the meanwhile, 40 gigabit, which was the leaf spine connection in 2016, is on a sort of terminal decline here. There's still some people using it, but there was no advantage to 40 gig because the 100 gig price point was essentially the same as 40 gig, excluding the optics. So as soon as the optics became available, people just very rapidly adopted 100 gig. The 400 gig hasn't shipped yet. I mean, there will be some announcements very shortly, but let's just say we'll start shipping in 2019, more or less, when optics become more available. The thing is, 400 gig is not the same price point than 100 because you have 8 lanes driving a 400 gig plug. This is 4 lanes. So for sake of argument, it will be twice the cost per port. But you also get 4 times the speed. So it's still half the cost per bandwidth if you follow the logic. But you wouldn't buy a 400 gig port if you want to plug in a 100 gig thing. That wouldn't make any sense. Whereas right around here, the 400 gig will actually go from 8 lanes to 4 lanes of 100 gig serial electrical feeding the module. And as that happens, it will become more cost competitive. And from a bandwidth standpoint, because one of these is 4 of these, it will actually cross over in bandwidth to 100 gig probably by the end of 21. At least that's the projection. And on the revenue side, because again, the highest speed ports cost more, the majority of the market already is 100 gig and above, and the 400 gig adds to the top of this. The speed of the transition from 40 gig to 100 gig was unreal, even for us. Within a year, the majority of new orders went to 100 gig ports from 40 gig ports. Again, the ramp on the 400 gig side is projected to be more slower. One big factor is the optics are not shipping yet, right? So they're actually not available. And if I could go back here for a second, the largest cloud customers right now, each quarter, they're buying 100,000 CWM4, like single mode 100 gig optics each. So they couldn't actually deploy a 400 gig data center because they couldn't get these 100,000 of optics until probably late next year, maybe 2020. But again, the projection is from less than 1 million ports in 19 to maybe 3, 4 in 21, 6 something in 22, and then 10 million plus in 21, 22. One thing important about these statistics and any public reports about ports is that the way the market analysts count these things is in terms of the products we and other vendors ship. So if it is a 100 gig port, they count a 100 gig port. If a customer takes that 100 gig port and converts it to 4x25, they didn't know that and we didn't know that, but they still count as a 100 gig port. In the case of 400 gig, there will be many people who will actually use a 400 gig port as a dual 200. You can actually configure it as a 2x200 or as a 4x100, or you could even do an 8x50. But all of these will be counted as 400 gig ports here. So nobody knows the exact breakdown because it comes down to how you deploy it. But they're all aggregated in this overall number. This is yet another market analyst, and also the same one projecting the crossover point in bandwidth now. And on that chart, could be 2020. I think it's 21. But there will be a point where 400 gigabit will carry more bits than 100 gigabit because, again, this is flatlining, whereas this is on this rapid race, and it's 4 times the bits per port, right? So the ports are much lower, but it's more bandwidth. And behind all of this, and maybe this is the most important point here, is that I'm not sure if you remember the old days. I'm sure actually you do, where Cisco would launch, I don't know, 10 gigabit Ethernet in 2000. It cost a fortune, and then it took literally, it took 8 years, from that initial 10 gig port until it was cheap enough so people could actually deploy it in volume. Well, that was the old world. In the new world, if the new thing isn't cheaper than the old stuff, nobody would use it, right? It's like, why would you use a new thing that's more expensive than the old? So the prerequisite for any new technology, 400 gig or beyond, to get adapted by customers and be deployed is that it's actually more cost effective than the previous generation. And that is actually true because of the nature of how this merchant silicon is evolving. Every new chip is better than the old, has more capacity, costs less per function. As a result, it is always true that the new thing is actually cheaper, and that is what is cranking the turns here much more quickly than in the past. Now, specifically on this merchant silicon evolution now, back in 2008, when Arista, our company here, started shipping its very first product, an ultra-low latency 10 gigabit switch, the only merchant silicon worth mentioning was this 24-port 10 gig switch here. 4 years later, we had a spine switch in a modular chassis. It wasn't layer 3 yet, but I guess it could do some layer 3, but it didn't have a lot of entries. As of 2016, we had the Jersey chip that can do routing, and now there are several DWM chips that are basically merchant silicon, which we have put on some cards so we could integrate the transport as well. But basically, you can build the entire network functionality with off-the-shelf chips. There are still proprietary chips out there. The companies that are building these, the thing is they're not growing in market share. So all the growth in the market, which is shown in blue here, are the merchant chips. And they have sort of held on to their relative volume, but it hasn't increased. Why is merchant silicon winning? Well, that's really easy. It's faster, it's cheaper, simpler, sooner. Basically, over the last 10 years, every year there was a new merchant chip coming out that was better than the last year model, more ports, more buffering, more routing tables, more throughput certainly. And this on this list, the last one is, I keep pushing the wrong button here, is the 2018 chip, which is announced, but the products are just getting announced very shortly, which is a single chip, 32-port 400 gig. You can also configure it as a 128-port 100 gig in one chip, which kind of replaces this chip that was 64 ports, which kind of replaced this chip that was 32 ports. And the following slide shows this how impressive these throughput gains have been year after year after year, where this is essentially Tomahawk 1, at 32 ports of 100 gig, still a very popular chip today. Tomahawk 2, 64 ports of 100, the 2U box. This is Tomahawk 3, which is shown as 2019 here when it ships in volume. But it's 12.8 terabits on a single chip. And because it's one chip here, one chip here, one chip here, the cost performance, the cost per bit keeps improving rapidly. Another thing that you may not realize is that, or you may have heard that Moore's law is kind of running out of steam, which is partially true. It's really expensive to make another 7 nanometer or even 5 nanometer kind of future foundry. But what you may not have realized is the networking chips, the kind of chips that we use as merchant silicon, are hopelessly behind on the curve. Every chip that we're shipping today is actually 28 nanometer, which is stuff that Intel shipped back in 2012, if you can believe this. The new chips coming out are 16. This is stuff Intel shipped in 2015. And it's only the chip after that, that's 7, that sort of catches up with Intel CPUs next year. The point of this is that there's more steps of improvement ahead because it's coming from way behind than Intel's going to get going from 10 to 7 essentially. So the denser chips means more buffers, more table size, more of all the things we like to have on a chip. And the other thing of this is this is happening like every other year. So every other year there's a new opportunity to redefine these chips. The other key issue in networking chips is how you get the bits in and out of the chip. This interface is known as the serializer, deserializer, shortened to SerDes. Back in 2012, they were like at 10 or 12.5 gig. All the stuff shipping today is 25 gig. The new chips that are just coming out have a 50 gig per lane interface. And then it's expected that by 21, this will improve to 100 gig. But the great thing about that is that every time you double the speed, even with the same number of SerDes, and they've been going up too, you double the bandwidth, to the point where the 2021 chip will predictably be a 25.6 terabit, up from the 12.8 terabit chips that are about to come out. So today, when you look at a 100 gig port, it's actually 4 lanes of 25, right? It's 4 lanes, 25 makes 100. You can split it into individual lanes or even 50 gig if you want, but that's how it works. The 400 gig ports that are coming out have 8 lanes of 50, right? And you can actually do 4 lanes as a 200 gig or 2 lanes as 100 gig. And then 2 years later, this becomes 4 lanes become 400 gig. One could build an 800 gig Ethernet with 8 lanes or 100 gig just with 1 lane. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the time frames between these things have gotten shorter. And the reason is, of course, it's a very competitive market, and there's many advantages to simply go faster here. So there are people who actually think that 50 gig was a short-term blimp here, and one might as well think about what's happening 2 years later, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But the point, this beyond 100 gig, it gets really, really hard to send signals on electrical traces across a PC board. And that means we're going to have 100 gig service for a long, long time. But everybody now is trying to race to get there. In the market, of course, these are not binary transitions. It's more like a wave. And these are mix of the total, so that there's still some 10 gig being shipped. 25 gig is still ramping in volume, right? It's like doubling next year, even though as the 50 gig comes in, that will make this decline. But the crossover most likely is only by 2020, where there's more of these than more of these. And then the 100 gig will show up in 21, depending when the chips are ready to be delivered. And because it's an easy substitute, probably will cross over within a year and then completely dominate forward. This is the same data in a nice waterfall kind of thing here, where 25 gig, which is what's shipping, is the green stuff here. Yellow is 50 gig, and then the orange 100 gig comes in. But this is the most interesting chart, which is because the total volume of these things keeps growing and growing in terms of shipments. The blue, which is the 100 gig Ethernet, which just I'm not sure there's any shipments which will start shipping in 21. By 2022, at least the forecasts will be more bandwidth shipped this way than the entire market was just 2 years before. So these are very rapid transitions from a merchant silicon, SerDes, call it ecosystem perspective. And the reason this is important is that the optics, that the pluggable optics, have to meet the electrical lanes, which is what we're talking about here. So there will be a changeover from essentially 50 gig lane optics here, the yellow stuff, to 100 gig lane optics, basically in 2 years from now. Now, why do people want to rush to 100 gig SerDes? Because it's cheaper. I don't need to tell you that we're actually in a very competitive industry. It may not always appear to you this way, but any cost reduction we take, and there are estimates how much the cost reduction is just switching the things, but what we know is it's half the lanes per port. So you can put more ports on a chip or make a smaller chip with the same number of ports. In either way, it's less die size, it's less power. The other good thing is that with the 100 gig lambda optics, which we'll talk about in a second, going from 50 gig to 100 gig is invisible to the system interface at the optical layer. So as long as the optics run in increments of 100 gig lambda, it doesn't matter that one system internally was 50 gig and there's 100 gig, it works. Because otherwise, whatever products you would buy next year would be incompatible with the products 2 years later, which would be a really bad thing. Here's a slide that sort of shows the projected mix between the things. So the blue here is the 50 gig, which again will start ramping next year into 20, even 21, when it will then start declining. And then the rest of this is taking over from the green stuff, and this is obviously the vast majority over time. So now we're getting to the optic standards here. So there are many optic standards for 400 gigabit to choose from. The ones you heard about is perhaps ZR, which we'll cover in a minute. That's coherent optics. FR8 and LR8 are 8 channels of 50 gig. This is 2 kilometers, 10 kilometers. Sounds good, but again, they won't work well in 2 years from now, so we would advise against these. Whereas FR4 and LR4 are 100 gig lambda, 4 channels each. Arguably, they're cheaper, 4 lasers than 8, but the most important thing is they're forwards compatible, and so is DR4, which is 4 channels, 8 fibers total, that you can break out into individual 100 gig DR, 100 gig interfaces, which can be terminated in a QSFP, by the way, on existing QSFP ports. So those are the kind of optics that are in the lab, and you will see them in the market next year. I want to highlight the work that the 100 gig lambda group has done, because what happened there is the IEEE, which is sometimes like too early to make decisions. They forgot to standardize FR4, which is actually going to be the most important thing. Duplex fiber, 100 gig, 4 channels, 100 gig over duplex. And with the standard, you can build the optics. So this group, within 3 months last year, finished writing the spec, and that's now really accepted for up to 2 kilometers. and they're working on a 10-kilometer version, which should be done shortly. So this is essentially done from a spec perspective. This was actually an IEEE spec that was now extended to 2 kilometers. That's just a DB link issue. And it interoperates with DR, which is this thing here, sorry, which are the variants of which are going to be called FR and LR, single channel 100 gig, one laser, could be done in a future SFP, by the way, and should be very cost effective. So these are the most economical single mode optics. There's other optics for multi-mode and so on that I didn't show here, but you should focus on these. And the nice thing from a cabling perspective, if you have a fiber plant that has 8 fiber for PSM4 today, it goes straight over to DR4, it's the same connector, and this is of course duplex fiber going to duplex fiber. And again, the most important thing is these things interoperate between 50 gig merchant silicon and 100 gig merchant silicon 2 years later. So going now to the perhaps somewhat controversial topic of the optics module form factor. These are, we're talking about the actual plugs. As we look forward, at least to 21, we really need a thing that actually runs at 100 gig speed. The actual speed, by the way, is 112 gigabaud because there's, forward air correction kind of overhead. Also, it really needs to handle 20 watts power because 800 or dual 400 gig optics actually takes 20 watts. And you still want to have, of course, 36 of these per 1U to get your 28 terabits per 1U in 2021. The thermal issue is a really hard one because the initial FR4, LR4 optics are coming out at about 12 watts. Over time, people think they can shrink that to 10 watts with a 7 nanometer, gearbox instead of 16 nanometer initially. But that's it. It's going to be a 10 watt optics. If you put 2 of those in the same envelope, you need 20 watts. And there's no other power saving doing this. So we, needless to say, are a big fan of the OSFP. This is a form factor we invented 2 years ago, started an industry multi-source agreement, which now has almost 100 members. It's like 96 and counting. And they all have the spec. The spec is owned by this group essentially to make sure nobody changes it. But what it does do is it does do 36 ports per 1U, 20 watts, and 112 gig SerDes. And we have demonstrated this in the lab certainly. QSFP has the same density, QSFP-DD, 36 per 1U, but it just doesn't have the same thermal performance or the same signal integrity, and I'll show in a second why that is. But basically, this is back to the initial generation of an 8-lane 50 gig. There's a gearbox here, right, that takes the 8x50 or 56 actually and converts it to 4x112 and drives these 4 lasers, 12 watts initially, going down to 10 watts with time. This would be a dual channel version of this. So it's dual 400 gig in one module, and it's 20 watts. There's no way around this. And there may be other modules like this one, which is like an 800 gig FR8, LR8, which runs the whole thing over just one duplex fiber. This should work up to 10 kilometers. So what we have done is we have actually built systems with our component suppliers that measured the electrical performance. This is, the electrical connector right here. I'm sure you can see it. And these are the test connectors for the scopes and the injected signal. And it has this 25 dB, insertion loss crosstalk band, which is what you want. And in case you wonder how this actually works, this is at 28 frequency because PAM4 is actually half the frequency, which is 56, and the maximum baud rate is half of that. So it's actually what the connector sees more or less is 28 gigabaud, even though it's really 112. Now, it will even work with passive cable. This hasn't been built yet, but on a simulation basis, we can do 2-meter passive with the 112 gig channel. Now here, and this is what it looks like. It looks very similar to a QSFP. It's just a little bigger, which gives us more surface area for the integrated heatsink and so on. Now the QSFP-DD, which is something Cisco is a big fan of, it will do 8 lanes per 50, obviously, 14.4 terabits. People are working to see if they can make it work at 112 gig. Let's just put it this way, it's not the connector you would have picked if you wanted to run it at 112. And we will actually build systems for certain customers that are QSFP-DD, so this was never a religious issue for us. But what we have measured is 15 watts in the same system. They can do 20 watts for the OSFP. The problem with the connector is there's 2 rows, where there's like the front and the back row. And the signals from the outer row like this is the outer row here, they actually have to go into the PC with this little micro via and then come back out on the other side. And these 2 extra vias just really have a bad impact on the performance, as shown as this measured result here. So this is the OSFP where all the traces are more or less the same. On the QSFP-DD, the inside traces are actually similar to this one, right? But the outer traces are like, when it gets to down here, 6 dB verse, which is, not going to be well received. Bottom line, if you rank these things in signal integrity, crosstalk, return loss, and so on, the OSFP is the best design. Kobo, which is not a pluggable form factor, but it uses the same connector, will work as well. So Kobo is now pitching they can do a 16-wide 112 gig module, and they can also handle the power. But you see, this is limited by signal integrity, by power, even the wire gauge for copper wires, and so on. So now, let me switch topics a little bit and talk about this ZR and ZR Plus optics, which I think is highly relevant to many of you. And I want to start with sort of overall trends in cost per bandwidth here and how the upcoming ZR Plus modules impact this and the kind of systems one can build with this. This is a chart from Deloro that looks at the cost per DWM link, and for a 400 gig link, which is actually cheapest per gigabit. Oops, sorry, this thing is very itchy here. Okay, the 400 gig is roughly $100 per gigabit per link, per line. I mean line. 200 gig is actually more expensive, and 100 gig is more expensive per gigabit. But that's and there was a significant cost reduction. Right? With all credit to the vendors here, the costs have come down, but they're in this range. 400 gig CR down here, it's so far lower. I didn't know how to position this. It's like an order of magnitude cheaper than what's going on here. And the reason is obvious. Historically, all these DSP systems were proprietary. Basically, vendor lock-in is a good thing for the vendor, but not for the customer. 400 gig CR is the first and only forward-looking standard that was standardized by OIF. There's at least 5 chip implementations that we know of, and more than that in terms of people making modules that will compete for your business. And on a per module basis now, the forward projected quotes we have seen are below $10 a gigabit in volume, basically $4,000 for one of these modules, which is, by the way, roughly this size. The other beautiful thing about modules is, what's in there is a 7 nanometer chip that handles not only 400 gig, but it will also support 200 gig and even 100 gig stair-step effect for those of you who want to use that. But it costs the same, so if you go slower, the cost per bit goes up, obviously. But the other thing that most people didn't know about is that the cost of doing a 700 chip is just off the charts. It's like a $40–50 million investment for the people doing that. So they don't want to do multiple chips. So what they're all doing is they're adding all the modes and the kitchen sink that they can fit in this chip to handle extended reach. And this is now known as ZR Plus, basically additional modes above the OIF standard, more dispersion compensation, more higher baud rates, whatever, better soft decision, whatever you can think of. And what we have seen is, at least on a projected basis, that will increase the reach from 100 kilometer to 1,000. Same module. It does take a little more power doing that, but the performance is truly approaching the performance of legacy high-end DSPs. And the difference is this: the 100 kilometer reach, the base standard, 15 watts power, will fit in a QSFP-D, will fit in a OSFP. But the interesting one, at least in your business, is actually this one here, which goes much further and takes just a little bit more power. So the way these modules will look like is, again, there's a 7 nanometer chip. That's the DSP, the miniaturized ICTC ROSA. There will be multiple SKUs, by the way. There's some vendors that will put in the whole EDFI amplifier while they add it, so you can do point-to-point without external amplification. Some people are talking about gray optics down to, not coherent, but 10 kilometer reach, like really cheap ones. They think they can compete there on a price basis. If you fill up the C band, you get 20. It's a 75 gigahertz spectrum, so you get 26 channels. If you fill up both C and L, you actually get 52 terabits over just one fiber. It does not get much better than that. And all of this for a 20-watt module that plugs right into any standard switch and router. So the beautiful thing for us as a system vendor is the same system design that supports switching and routing client interfaces on the same density. You can plug in a DWM, ZR plus optics, and of course easily field replace it. The beautiful thing for you in volume, you can source these modules directly from the vendor and avoid all the margin stacking that has been going on. And again, there may be 5 different SKUs here. We don't know how they're going to position, but think everything from 10 kilometer to 100 to 300 to 1,000, high output power, gray, whatever. So it's a very interesting, I would say almost revolutionary thing. Certainly in Europe, with a 1,000-kilometer reach, you can go anywhere. I'm not sure there's one link on here that's 1070, maybe from the bottom of Sweden to the top. I was told it's more than 1,000, but you can run that in 200 gig mode. That will actually go 2,000 kilometers. In the US, it's amazing what these things do. There's a couple of things that are more than 1,000, but practically speaking, you cover most of the use cases short of submarine cables with this thing. And there were, of course, pluggable form factors today. You may be familiar with the CFP2 form factor, which is available now as a 200 gig 16 QAM, 1,000 kilometers. So this is shipping today. The thing is, you only get 8 per 1U, and we actually built one system that has these, but it's a customized design just because of these modules. The other module that has been very, very popular, at least in the cloud metro market, is the Color Z in 500 gig, which uses 2 lambda. 2 times 50 gig PAM4 essentially, and gets to 100 kilometer with. It's cheap but hard to deploy. Let's just leave it at that. But the limitation of that is it's only 100 gig, and because you're using up 2 wavelengths per 100 gig, you only get 4 terabits per fiber. Where this thing, even just in C-band is 26, and in CNL is 10 times more bandwidth per fiber, and nobody wants to rent more fiber. So basically, this will be the logical successor, to these type of modules, which were pluggable, and the benefits of that. Now, there are some market projections on where the bandwidth is going. This is a company called Signal AI, or Active Insight, not artificial intelligence, that projected that 400 gig will start ramping quickly here and will actually be the majority by 2021, which it probably could be more aggressive yet, because what happens is with these ZR DSPs, it's the same chip that does all 3, right? You can run it in a 100 gig mode, but you're not getting the value of your investment. And 200 gig was just kind of an odd number, meaning if you can do 200 gig and you can go 400 gig the same reach, why bother? So we like this a lot, and I think it will help you to make very cost-effective kind of systems with just completely different price performance, no need for separate transport shelves, platforms. The key thing that I forgot to mention here is obviously this is an IP network. There's no optical layer 1 management here. Layer 3 routing, failover, ECMP works just like it would work in a data center. And the economics, we believe, will drive very, very rapid adoption, especially for DCI type of interconnects. And there is a roadmap here to 800 gig ZR. You heard it here first, but we have been told from more than one vendor they think they could actually do this in 7 nanometer, but they need a new very high baud rate analog digital converter running at 120 gigabaud compared to 60 gigabaud today. But as soon as they got that, they will tape out the next chip that goes twice as fast. Yet it doesn't get you more bits per fiber because there's a wider spectrum, but it drives COPEX down because it's one device that's twice as fast, and you could tunnel 2 400 gig ports over one 800. So a couple of slides what we plan to do here. Obviously, overall, we're always trying to build the best products for you, the way we work with our largest customers, in particular in the cloud space, is we truly optimize the products for the needs. But the key thing is, the focus on the software, which is 95% of what we do is software, is that it's ready to deploy at FCS when the chip works and we launch it. It works at full quality, no exceptions. And because these silicon chips have such a short lifetime, maybe just 2 years, it's critical to get these things out quickly into the market. In the case of 100 gigabit, this has allowed us to we continue to have the number 1 position of any vendor shipping 100 gig ports since the last 2 years. We have, as of the first quarter, this is the last one I have on the slide, we had 40% market share in terms of port shipped, more than Cisco at 33 and the rest of the market. And we know this has continued at least Q2. It's not on this chart. Our products. Again, I won't spend any time on this. But going back to the chips I mentioned earlier, so this was again Tomahawk 1, Tomahawk 2, Tomahawk 3. The very, very first product which we have shown at trade shows, so we'll show you one here, is a 1U 32-port 400 gig switch. 1220 terabits in 1U. This is the OSFP version. We had one important customer wanted a QSFP DD version, so they will exist as well. Looks otherwise the same. But the key thing is this will actually be available for field trials this calendar year and be in full production in Q1. Now, the question we get most often, of course, is when is the router going to improve? And the thing here is that the current chips, which are called J1 Plus, this is J1 Plus here, have about 10 100 gig ports per chip. It's obviously a VQ fabric, so in any system there's many of these chips. The new chip, which is called J2, has a stunning 48 100 gig ports per chip, so it's almost 5 times more ports per chip, which greatly improves cost, performance, density, and so on. One of the first products you will see on this next year is this is just a single chip box that has 32 100 gig ports and 4 400 gig OSFP ports, 4.8 terabit throughput, 4 gigabit buffer, 2 million routes, 2.5 billion packets per second. And then there will be another 1U box that has 2 chips back to back, so there's no fabric, it's just 2 chips mated together. They will do 24 400 gig ports in 1U, almost 10 terabits throughput, 8 gigabits buffer, 5 million packets. Now, the kind of, then we'll also do some low-end stuff like 32 10 gig, 25 gig, aggregating up to 2 400 gig ports as well. And any of the 400 gig ports can support CR, right? So you can actually imagine building a distributed, I don't know how to call this, internet aggregation across the country that is just 4 of these 1U routers, so it's 4-way ECMP redundant, connected to 24 edge devices that aggregate up to 32 100 gig each. So it's slightly oversubscribed, okay? But the throughput of this thing here, 30 terabits per second with just 96 of these links, which can be 100 to 1,000 kilometers long, right? So you can, I feel bad for the prior investments in the space, lots of big boxes, because we do see a lot of interest in smaller boxes going forward. We'll build the big boxes too, by the way, but you get so much out of a little box, it's just amazing. This is the same picture for the 1025 gig aggregation device, which has 2 uplinks. You get 2-way ECMP failover, and that will do 19.2 terabits with 48 links, like 2 boxes here and 24 of these. So we do hope that this should be exciting to you as we go forward. And one thing I should mention in any of these pictures, the dominating cost is the optics, not our router. So the optics cost way more than everything else on this slide here. But since you will be able to buy those directly in volume, that should really help. So let me go back to 400 gigabit and what we like about this sort of David Letterman style. The number one, well, there's many good things, but the first one on my list is just the density improvement. As you realize, smaller boxes are cheaper to build, they take up less rack space, and so on. 4 times the throughput per 1U. That doesn't happen every year, but it happened this year compared to our previous product, which was 3200 gig ports, 3.2 terabits. Now, the power efficiency improved as well. The new box does take more power. It's roughly twice the power, a little less than twice the power per box without the optics. But on a per throughput basis, it's twice as good. It's half the power per throughput compared to this. And then on a price performance basis, as I mentioned earlier, the new box will be roughly twice the cost per port, but each port is 4 times faster. So it's actually, you get twice the price performance, twice the bandwidth per dollar. Scalability, you can take an existing network topology, reuse the same fibers, upgrade from 100 gig to 400 gig, it's 4 times faster without any other change. This is obviously driven by the improvements in the underlying silicon that I mentioned. There is one, I added this point this morning, one thing about the cost performance improvement. If you take a 400 gig port and you split it into 2x200 or 4x100 DR, you get the same cost per port or per bit as the 400 gig, you realize, right? So the way to go cheaper, even on the 400 gig, is in the future, on the 100 gig, is to use the 400 gig ports and just split them. The only negative is that it's 400 gig DR. This is a single channel 400 gig. There will be QSFP ports on the other side that match it, but it's not 100 gig CWM4, which is the most popular single mode optics. We are actually going to build boxes that use the same new silicon with a whole bunch of 100 gig conventional ports. but they take a lot more power, and they actually are almost twice as expensive than the 1U version. So, not sure, it's less power. But the way to save money on 100 gig is to go to 100 gig DR, and there are large customers who are going to deploy these chips with 200 gig CLM4. There's 2 channels per 400 gig optic. That one advantage of that, I should mention, is that you can configure the port in the 100 gig CLM4 mode, meaning it's the same optics for 100 gig, which means they can talk to the legacy installed base of 100 gig CLM4, which in the case of some of these customers is now 1 million ports. So they have a very large sort of upgrade problem there. But again, this all can be done in the context. These are all OSFP ports with dual optics or these 4 channels. Number 7, it's forward compatible to the 100 gig system that I mentioned earlier. So whatever products are coming out in 2019, internally are 50 gig SerDes, 2 years later, 100 gig SerDes. You want to use 100 gig lambda optics so they talk to each other. Don't use the 50 gig lambda optics. They will not be supported in as little as 2 years. We do like the OSFP. It's the only one that works well for future 112 gig electrical and the 20 watt performance. And again, it has this interoperability advantage. We're a big fan of 400 gig ZR and ZR1 for data center interconnect. Again, the great thing for us, no extra system designs for you. Basically, economics will drive the adoption here. And number 10, there is a roadmap to 800 gig. The idea was to take the 8-lane Ethernet standard, the 400 gig 8 lanes, and just double the speed on each lane. So there's not much standards work required, but it's actually hard to implement on the chip because all the buses have to go twice as fast or twice as wide, and the chip people have been resisting this because it's hard to do. Now, some people suggest that 16-lane interfaces, there has never been an Ethernet that had 16 lanes that was popular. Going faster than 112 is really hard, so nobody's thinking about that either. So we do expect to see native 800 gig ports by 2022, which will then support, again, dual 400 and 4x200 and 8x100, but it's not committed yet. Now, to sum up this in yet another way here, new chips, more bandwidth, 4 times the bandwidth density, twice the power efficiency, twice the price performance, which you can also get if you split the port into 4x100 with 100 gig DR. 4 times the scalability per topology, higher throughput chip. Bigger pipes are easier to manage in many cases. Stay with 100 gig lambda. The ecosystem is only 2 years away. In fact, by the time 400 gig gets to any real volume, it will phase over to the 100 gig electrical. And then OSFP just has the best performance there. This thing is just a game changer in my mind. Approaches the performance. It's like 1 dB less than the best historical ones. And it's just the best price performance. And this is future. Bottom line, the easiest way to go faster is to go faster, and this is what actually drives the price performance going forward. So that's the end of my slides, but we have time for questions, so anything you want to ask me is fair game.
So, question right here. Microphone, please.
Okay. 100 gig DR, is that 112 gig a baud?
Correct. So for simplification here, to avoid the...
on the optical layer.
Yes, of course. Yeah. To avoid any confusion with, QSFP 28, which is really 25 gigabit. I mean, it reminds me of, when they had hard disks in the early days of computing, and the vendors announced their raw capacity, and they didn't tell you that 5% was overhead that you never got, and there was this big lawsuit that actually forced the disk vendors to state the actual capacity rather than the theoretical capacity. So we're into the real numbers you would see in terms of the application. So when we're talking about 50 100 gig lanes, the lanes run faster because there's forward error correction overhead. So other people call this 56 and 112. And it makes a difference when you, there's some proposal to go to a terabit Ethernet with 8 lanes, which would require 156 gigabaud SerDes. And the people looked at that, compared, they're already doing the 112. It's so expensive to do just the SerDes development, they just don't want to do it. And it's not clear how far the reach is on the PC board traces either. But yes, 100 gigabit in my dictionary means 112 gigabaud baud rate on the electrical and the optical channel.
So let me put that into context. I was worried about dispersion affecting, when you go into the photonics part,
Oh yeah, but
if you're
now
blinking the
you're
light,
talking
that's
CR. You're talking CR now, not.
Okay,
You're talking
I thought
2
100
kilometer, like 10 kilometer.
10
Oh
kilometer.
yeah, yes, there is dispersion, and 10 is a stretch. Okay, there are some people who knows. At least claimed that it may have to be 9 kilometer, which doesn't make sense to anybody. So they were told to go back and work on the chirping and whatever to try to get to 10. But the reason that the 10 kilometer spec isn't done is there's no agreement that it's easily implementable, whereas 5 kilometer was easy. So there's this stretch limit at 10, which is also why beyond 10 kilometers, it's almost certainly all going to be coherent, meaning high order modulation, which then can go hundreds of kilometers.
Yeah, because with 100 gig with the 4 wavelengths, ER basically never happened. I mean, they called
they claimed
really
they can do 20, but it wasn't really there. Yeah.
So what we're going to see is the 10 kilometer of 4 times 100 with DR is going to be dispersion limited primarily.
Most likely. And again, if your links are really 5 instead of 10, you're much safer. But I realize 10 kilometers is a very popular size in your business for city level aggregation, right? So there are some people, by the way, who believe the high order modulation should really go down to 2 kilometer, and anything beyond 2 should be HOM. And the thing I didn't mention here is if you look inside the module, and it's this little gearbox chip, right? And look at the 7 nanometer DSP, the chip's are almost the same size from a die standpoint. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing, but the I/O dominates the die size, and the logic is actually just a small part in the middle. So people have argued that these DSP chips should be sold at the same cost as a gearbox chip, essentially, and just do everything starting at 2 kilometers. The vendors who make the chips haven't quite signed up to this yet, but there's so many chips coming out that there may be a wave of these that are just lower priced for that application. And there is another case that in certain data centers, they're running out of fibers between buildings, and it's so expensive to rip up the grounds and put in more fiber that it may be cheaper to do these very low-cost coherent things just between buildings.
Yep.
So that may be happening.
And not that I hope anyone does this in here, but there will be no multi-mode, right?
No, there will be. The most amazing thing to me is this: I've talked to 3 VCSEL people, and they all claim they will be able to do 100 gig PAM4, maybe 30 meters. But in the enterprise, where the installed fiber is multimode, and nobody wants to touch it. So, and the enterprise is not the early adopter of 100 gig. So the 100 gig VCSELs are like 21, 22. They're in the lab, but they're not in production, let's call it. But they're very optimistic that these AOC cables, or the cheapest AOCs will have multimode inside, certainly. In the same, there are AOCs for 50 gig right now, so those exist. But the 100 gig they have to redo their chips.
Right. But we're talking, you said 30 meters? Or
maybe 50.
Maybe 50, but...
You have to ask the vendor spinning. I'm just passing on what I heard. My view is I believe it when I see it. It's
right,
too
but
far.
some people with fiber plants that have like 300 meters and so on.
No way. I mean, 100 meter would be like the best case.
Right.
And, yeah, put in more single mode. Now, single mode is also cheaper, as you know, right? Multi-mode. And you may have to upgrade to the latest OM5 or whatever, which is really expensive.
So which of these optics will be available next year?
They all will be available. It's just, the problem here is that, I don't know how to say this, everybody's trying to qualify for these large cloud guys. So they all have, even the samples are getting allocated to these largest customers to make sure they're happy and that they will place the big orders to then start the ramp. And that will be, to me, like first half of next year is all qualification time, lots of testing, because people are not going to put any big order in until they validate that it actually works. So the ramp of 400 gig is really the second half next year once the qualification is done. So we have lab samples of these today, but they're not production released.
And that's also for the coherent stuff?
Yes, that CR chips haven't been taped out yet. So they're getting marketed at various trade shows. But the truth is, until they're taped out and measured, you don't know which vendor works. There's multiple designs. We hope to see samples, call it middle of next year, but production is essentially end of next year. So it is about a year out for in any volume, what I was talking about here. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we are talking about the future, which hopefully is exciting. But once they're out, they can ramp them fairly quickly.
Question on the side over there.
Hi. I'm not about to buy a 400 gig switch, but I am super curious about your perspective on hardware development. And this is a very high level question, so interpret it as you see fit. How much easier has it gotten to develop hardware as compared to 10 years ago? You talk a lot about price performance and so on, and it seems, yeah, how...
Yeah, you have to separate the chips and the rest of the box, right? The chips are getting more expensive for each generation of technology. To tape out just a tape out cost for 7 nanometer chip right now is $10 million for the masks, right? Which means you can't make a mistake because you can't afford to do it twice, which means you have to spend yet more time in validation and verification and so on and so on, and with all the latest CAD tools. So the budget for chip design of that sort is $10 million tape out cost, 10 million CAD tools to make sure you checked everything, and then your people that do the design and the verification. And one advantage that Broadcom has here, which is the leader in making these merchant chips, is that they have obviously previous designs, so they can take the IP blocks that already were validated in the previous chip and then double the number of ports and then tape out the next chip fairly easily compared to a startup who first has to validate all the new blocks that they yet had to design, right? So the big advantage of a person already or a company in this business is to make a N+1 chip is much, much easier than doing the first one because you have to build up the whole library, basically. But there are startups that claim to make good chips here, and we are always a fan of even better chips, so we're looking at all these chips. But it is getting more expensive. And on the system side, at Arista, we obviously built these boxes, but as I may have mentioned, 95% of our engineers are software engineers working on the all the various pieces of EOS, roughly 1/3 of them just on the routing and MPLS and all the stuff which we still have to get out. The hardware team is only 50 people out of 1,000 people engineering, and mostly what we do is electrical, signal integrity, mechanical, design validation, all the tests that make sure that the product is rock solid. But we're not really designing in the design sense. We're just implementing the connectivity and so on. And obviously we can't make a mistake because otherwise it wouldn't work. But that's a well understood task. So one engineer can crank out like 2 products a year. So that's easy. To do a chip design, you need maybe hundreds of people that are experts in the various parts of the chip and work together to try to get it out faster with some parallel processing effort involved.
Sorry, I should have said how. What if you use a 65 nanometer process?
Oh, you couldn't do that because the density is not competitive. It's just not fast enough.
Oh, sure.
So the real advantage of the latest process is you get lower power, higher speed bus, everything improves. But you have to spend the money and the tape out. And you only get that back in volume. So it basically means that unless you get enough volume, you can't afford it.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Andy? Okay, well, please join me in thanking Andy for a very good presentation.
Thank you very much.
So the next speaker is Fredrik Stromberg, is the co-founder of Mulvad. Fredrik established his first connection with the internet in the mid-1990s and has been fascinated by networks, open source software, and security ever since. In 2009, together with Daniel Bernstein, he co-founded Mulvad, a privacy-focused VPN service. And today he would talk about some reflections on operating this service. So please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. All right. Half a century ago, a man named Manfred Clynes coined the word cyborg to describe humans that in some way have merged with their machines. Clynes saw the marriage between organism and technology as a means of expanding human experience by taking care of specific problems automatically and unconsciously, just as our hearts beat without conscious control. Many life forms use tools as a modification of the physical self to extend its abilities, it's certainly not a new concept for us. What makes the information age different is that instead of extending our physical abilities, we are using intelligent machines to extend our mental selves. We have all experienced the side effects. For example, we are losing our ability to concentrate. The role of facts is diminishing due to our susceptibility to manipulation and cognitive biases, and we are losing our ability to tolerate boredom. The current interface between us and our intelligent machines is pretty one-sided. Our eyes and ears can receive and interpret a lot of information quickly, but our feedback is only about 10 to 50 bits per second as we type with our hands. I invite you to imagine a future 5-10 years from now when we have better interfaces. Imagine what machine learning will do with twice or 10 times the bandwidth. To quote Elon Musk, it's mostly about the bandwidth, particularly your output. This technology could be used to serve you, help you do more meaningful things with your time, together with people you love, even make the world a better place. But unfortunately, maybe that's not the trajectory we're heading on. There's a downside, of course. I think you all know Harari, the historian who wrote Sapiens, Homo Deus, and now 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. I highly recommend the third book, or at least read an article summarizing it. It's quite thought-provoking. He says, the algorithms are watching you, and once they know you better than you know yourself, they could control and manipulate you. Unfortunately, based on the current behavior of a lot of companies and governments, we should expect increasing abuse. I'm sure most of you have experienced the addictive appeal of mobile apps, for instance. No wonder trust in tech companies is eroding. And trustworthiness is important. The services we provide require our users to trust us. They should feel confident in expecting us to fulfill our obligation, fulfill our commitment toward them, now and in the future. This is also the reason why security should be deeply ingrained in the tech company's culture. Security is how we gain trust in our systems, so that we may earn it from our users in turn. Ultimately, I think this philosophy calls upon us to build solutions that rely less on trust of human character and more on technology and mathematics. Which brings me to the idea of transparency. People in power should be held to a higher standard than the rest of us, because with power comes the ability to acquire more as well as conceal it. We expect transparency and accountability from our leaders. The more power, the more accountability. Shouldn't we require the same from the hardware and software we use? Especially as that hardware and software is increasingly, effectively becoming extensions of our minds. Which brings me to the technological foundations upon which we build. They are not particularly trustworthy, nor are they transparent. Most of you probably know this, but it deserves mentioning again because of how insane it is. When your Intel or AMD CPU starts, it is bootstrapped with firmware on an SPI flash memory. Some of this firmware is encrypted, and Intel won't release the source code. If you start an Intel computer without this encrypted blob, it will run for 30 minutes and then turn off. The computer clearly works without this encrypted blob, but Intel won't let you run your computer without this encrypted blob. The SPI flash is one example of where attackers can persist their backdoors even after you reformat or replace the hard drive. There are others. It is highly unfortunate that it is so hard to get back to a known good state. I could talk a long time about the BMC and the IPMI and all that technology, that you house in your data centers, but I'll let current articles speak for themselves. Complexity isn't only an issue in hardware, of course. Another problem is software configuration complexity. Here's an example. Here's a concrete example from my industry. Last year, there was approximately 550,000 OpenVPN servers running on the default port. Heartbleed was 4 years ago. And in case you don't recall, Heartbleed was a vulnerability in OpenSSL that enabled the attacker to extract some of the memory from web servers in particular, although this affected other services that use OpenSSL as well. It was used initially to extract cookie information, session IDs and stuff, and then it was hypothesized that you could use it to extract private key information, bits from your SSL certificate. We thought about this, and we thought we could do the same thing with OpenVPN, and we did. We managed to extract one of the primes out of memory. OpenVPN multiplexes TLS inside its own wrapping protocol. It multiplexes a TLS connection with an IP tunnel. And so we managed to exploit Heartbleed within OpenVPN, extracting one of the primes, and using one of the primes and the modulus, which is public, we managed to recreate the other prime. So clearly, these certificates should have been revoked and regenerated, but they weren't. If VPN authentication was simpler, if TLS configuration was simpler, perhaps this wouldn't be the case. I should probably mention that one of these certificates was actually shared with 7,000 servers. Fun fact. Now, moving on to software in general. My point with this slide is roughly the security in depth is not very good. If you own the web browser, you own the machine. Once you can execute code, the attack surface is so large that a lot of us consider it game over. Firefox deserves a shout out for trustworthiness on this slide, and I will tell you why. So let's look at technology that I believe is more worthy of our trust. These are great examples of technology that embody what I'm trying to convey. Above all, they facilitate trust in various ways. Rust, the R, is a systems programming language. Its performance is on par with C++, and yet it is memory safe, and it doesn't need a garbage collector. We can use it to make kernels, we can use it to make network stacks, we can use it to make browsers, you can use it in embedded controllers, even real-time systems. As opposed to, well, I'm hoping that increasingly we will replace C and C++ with Rust, where security is of critical importance. We use Rust. We built a desktop application in it. It works pretty well. There's an audit out. You can read it. In any case, the Q stands for Cubes. Cubes is a security-oriented operating system. It uses the hypervisor Xen at the bottom. And now my screen died. There we go. It uses Xen at the bottom, and then it compartmentalizes your digital life into VMs. So in the default installation, you have, for instance, your network, your Wi-Fi card. It needs some firmware, it needs drivers, it needs, well, you need a DHCP client if you're connected to the network here, for instance. So what you do is you assign your network card with the drivers and the DHCP client to a VM. And your VM might even be disposable. It might regenerate every time you start the computer. And then connected to this VM, you could have another VM running your VPN client. And connected to this one, you have a VM for your browser, for your private stuff, for your work stuff, for your SSH sysadmin VM or whatever. And suddenly, if someone exploits the drivers for your network card or the DHCP client, they're not also getting into the environment where you have your SSH keys. This is what all of our sysadmins use. And I think that the founder, the team behind Cubes, and in particular the founder, Joanna Rutkowska, she has some really good ideas on what would make good operating systems. So I highly recommend you to take a look at her blog. There are 2 papers in particular. One is called x86 Considered Harmful. The other one is called State Considered Harmful. And she paints a pretty beautiful vision of what personal computers could be, in particular with the future that I have painted in previous slides. WireGuard is a modern VPN technology. It is extremely simple. It's fast. It's using state-of-the-art cryptography. It's opinionated. It doesn't allow you to choose the cryptographic suites, which means it's a whole lot less complex than TLS. Its kernel module is written in 4,000 lines of code. IPsec, in contrast, is 400,000 lines of code. You can even implement WireGuard without dynamic memory allocation. So it has a very strong security story. And for those interested in performance, I think you'll find that not only is the performance comparable to IPsec, it would also be possible to implement this in FPGAs or chips without too much work. So, and one feature in particular that I would like to highlight in WireGuard is its ability to optionally mix in a pre-shared key in its key derivation function. So there is you've all heard about quantum computers, of course. We don't know when we'll get large enough quantum computers to crack some of the cryptographic primitives underlying our security protocols today. I spoke with a researcher in Toronto whose research field is this exact subject. When will we have quantum computers that are powerful enough? And if I recall correctly, he put the risk in excess of 10% that before 2030 we will have those kinds of computers. And I asked him, what has changed recently? And he told me that they kept revising the number downwards. And I asked him, what has changed in the last five years? And he said, well, 3 years ago, researchers would have to hound funders, potential funders for grants. And today, there are multiple organizations spending in excess of $1 billion each on building quantum computers. So that's quite fascinating. But how does this relate to WireGuard? Well, the ability to mix in a pre-shared key means that in a world where Diffie-Hellman and elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, the cryptographic algorithms underlying perfect forward secrecy in IPsec, in TLS, and in all the other protocols, it would be really nice if a quantum computer wouldn't be able to retroactively decrypt all of the traffic that the attacker has recorded. So all the TLS traffic today, for instance, and IPsec traffic that's being recorded and saved in Utah, perhaps, or somewhere else, it will be retroactively decryptable once there is a quantum computer powerful enough. Perfect forward secrecy won't work because Diffie-Hellman and elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman will be retroactively breakable. So using a pre-shared key that you perhaps have walked over to your friend and given to him or her, then suddenly your traffic would be post-quantum confidential. Or you could use one of the post-quantum secure key exchange algorithms. Diffie-Hellman, elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, they're not post-quantum secure, but there are those who are. And they are becoming, the first standardization conference for those was actually this year in April, or maybe May. In any case, WireGuard, as far as I'm concerned, is the future of VPN technology. So if you use VPNs, I highly recommend you to take a look at it. If you have sysadmins, I highly recommend you to take a look at cubes. And if you're writing things in C or C++, I would highly recommend you to take a look at Rust. Oops. So, how does this relate to you as ISPs? Well, you operate the global digital nervous system over which our ideas and most intimate communications flow. You are the guardians of our metadata, an asset which has only increased in value. I hope that my perspective on trustworthiness and the future of privacy has given you some food for thought. A thought I had the other day, and I spoke to some of my ISP friends, is that, well, it seems to me, this is not my area of expertise, but it seems to me that the more direct peering you do, the more privacy-friendly the internet becomes, because it means fewer points, fewer hops where someone can intercept the traffic. It means a more distributed internet where an attacker would have to own more systems to be able to survey the same amount of traffic. That's just an idea. As technology becomes an ever larger part of our mental self, the potential for abuse and manipulation will only grow. Privacy relies on the trustworthiness of our digital systems, and trust is facilitated by security. Let's do what we can to make our technology foundations as sound as possible. Let's make sure that those foundations serve us as users and no one else. I'm quite optimistic about the future. The potential for improvement is immense. The greatest ideas and insights lie ahead of us. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Are there any questions, comments, reactions for Fredrik? Okay, well, please join me in thanking him for a very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you, Fredrik. Thanks. So the final speaker of this afternoon's session is Anna Lundin. Anna is the technical lead at Research Laboratories, where she works with advanced software innovations in the fight against cancer and to help hospitals design radiation therapy treatments. As a domain expert and technical lead, Anna's goal is to build a logical, fast, and easy-to-use application based on solid, safe, and extendable architecture. So please welcome Anna to the stage.
Hi. Glad to be here. The final talk is going to be something that's completely not network. I'm going to talk about how to use software in the fight against cancer. I studied in Uppsala, Master of Science in Computer Science. I worked last 20 years with computer software development in medicine. First, we're writing an API for haptics and graphics interaction. Haptics is where you can touch things with force. And then we utilized that API to write medical simulators. It was a great technique. It was quite the opposite of the management. So then I transferred over to research, where I work today. We work with software for planning cancer treatments. I started with deformable modeling, very similar to what we did there, but to be able to track the dose in patients when you move over time. Then I've been technical lead for our major software product, for a lot of years, and now I also work a lot with product owner questions and try to get new cool stuff into the model in a consistent way. So research, when I started, we were around 20 people. We worked in Unix environment, wrote C++ in Emacs. We had a plugin that only did optimization services to other vendors. They didn't want to be as fast as we wanted with getting out new cool stuff there, so we started to sell to end users. That means that we have grown very much. We didn't have one sales guy and no support. Now we have much more of that. So we're 292 employees, 146 in research and development, and all of us sit in Stockholm. There we also have the management and more of that. We sell to clinics all over the world, so we have a lot of subsidiaries and also distributors. But going over to what I'm going to talk about is how you use software for planning radiotherapy treatments, and also a bit about why you need very advanced software to plan for radiotherapy. To start, we work with external radiation, and that is that you direct the radiation at the tumor from somewhere outside of the body instead of inside. What you see here is a linear accelerator. That's the most common one. Many thousands of those exist out there, and they use photons, X-rays, or electron beams to aim at the patient tumor. The aim is to destroy the cancer cells and then spare as much as possible of the surrounding tissue. You can also use the same if you just want to relieve pain, if it has gone too far. Going back here, this arm here can turn around. And in the upper part here, there is something called a multi-leaf collimator. Or now it is. It could also be as a square or a round shape. But in the recent years, it offers a leaf things where you can move the leaves in the upper part. And then you can shape the beam down towards the tumor to get a much more consistent delivered dose. When you do treatment planning, our aim is to create a specification that the machine will then use to deliver that plan to the patient. So we more or less create a plan, and we use a standardized protocol called DICOM, like Digital Imaging and Communications in Medicine, where the specification will be delivered. So our job is to create the best specification possible for each individual patient. So this is our software called RayStation. And as you can see, you can look at the machine down to the left. You can see the dose. You can see where the beam comes in at different directions. One important thing is that when you create a plan, you need to create a specific plan for each individual person. So you need to know the position of the tumor, you need to know the size and the shape, you need to know how aggressive the tumor is, and then the density and shape of all surrounding tissue. So if we start, we have a patient. This is a lung patient. You can see the tumor up here. Back off. So you have to aim the beam in the middle of the target, and then you can shape all the leaves around the target with the multi-leaf collimator. And then you can deliver the dose. You believe. But if you start off, you're going to see that down here is the tumor. The beam comes in front of the patient, and you see here, the red part, that's the high dose area. So we get a lot of dose to the patient that kills parts, but not where the tumor actually is. And that is due to, if you look at the depth of photons, it is like it enters the body. It's, no, wrong button. Me too. Photons, when they have high speed, they deliver a lot of dose. When the speed decreases, it doesn't deliver as much dose any longer. So you can see that when we enter the body, it's a lot of high dose, and then it just shrinks. So we need to do something. This is the patient. I'm going to show this again so just so you know where you are. Here you see in the view of the beam Down here, you can see that the beam is entering from the front. Here you see the front. And then I'm going to click once more. Now you see the beam in front in here. And this is actually a slice of the patient. So you can see that the beam is entering up here. So what we have to do is to deliver a lot of beams from all around the body. So you get the high dose area in the middle of the tumor. Then comes the next problem. This is a water square. And we have 3 exactly equivalent beams coming in here. All of this is water except this part where it's air. Down here it's bone. And if we deliver just one beam here, we can see this high dose area here and it reaches down here. If we deliver this beam and there is an air gap, the photons will not stop, be hindered. So they will continue to have the same high speed when they get out of the air. So you actually move where the high dose area is. If you instead hit something that has a higher density, all the beams going to get stopped. This means that you need to know how all the surrounding tissue is, all around where the tumor is, to know what actually the delivered dose will be. And if we take a look at this again, you can see now this beam is entering down here. I don't know if you could, but see there's like green streaks down there, where we actually have taken into account the actual density of the patient. So this means that you need to know a lot about the patient. There's a lot of different imaging techniques: CT, computer tomography, MR, or MRI it can also be called, ultrasound, PET. We always use CT, or almost often, when we plan for radiation, because it's very stable. You can go directly from a CT pixel value over to what the density actually is. You match that per CT machine, as we can see here to the right. This is just an image of a CT machine. It takes X-ray images from a lot of angles. It processes it with computer, and then you get a lot of slices out of this, one by one, that we can import into our software. What we do is that we build a full 3D volume out of this, that you can scroll through, look through, and see what happens. You can see in one slice or over the full body. And then you can define how the anatomy of the patient actually is. So by knowing the patient anatomy, we can compute the dose, and we can present what the dose will be to the patient. But when we have all this information, it has been historically a lot of hard work, human fiddling around with things. Then the idea came, what if we just tell the computer what we want, and the computer can create the optimal plan? You want a lot of dose in the target, and you want no dose outside of the target. And also it's a bit more intrigued than that, because here we have the target that we want to have a lot of dose. If we have the spinal cord, it's like a nervous system. You need to have signals going from one end to the other. There we're very much interested in the maximum dose, because there will be no signal if something is dead in the middle. If we take a look at the lungs instead, we don't care about a little bit, because you can survive with the rest of it. So different areas in the body requires different, can cope with different amount of radiation. So what we do, I don't know if everyone sees it, but down here, we have just set up like equals objective function, which tells us what we want. We say that the lung tumor, that we would like to have a uniform dose. We say that in the rest of the body, we want it to slide down. In the spinal cord, we say that there is a maximum dose. And in the lungs, we say, oh, the medium dose are not allowed to exceed a certain extent. And then we go ahead and compute. And maybe you see up into the right here that for each time we compute, we move the leaves a little bit, we compute the dose, and we try to move them in the way that makes the most optimal dose out of this. So what will happen then is these leaves that were sitting up there to create a good shape. You can see them down here. So if I play here, you're going to see that for this beam, if it plays, no. It doesn't. Okay, no, it did. You're going to see that from every angle, it tries to find, it delivers several times from each place. So it can sculpt the dose. It says if I take a little bit there and a little bit there and a little bit there, it can shape the dose much more. And that means that if we take this case as an extreme case, you can deliver a lot of dose and then you can scalp out something that you actually would like to spare. And the cool thing about this is that most often you don't aim at a higher kill rate. What you strive for is try to protect as much as possible about the surrounding tissue so that after you get the treatment, you actually get a good life afterwards. So that is often the biggest aim of what we do. So if you then presses this type of machine to the maximum, you can see that down here you can see that now we're delivering radiation, and you can see that the leaves are moving meanwhile we actually radiate. And if you take a look at the upper part, you can also see that the full machine is swiveling at the same time as you deliver dose. So in this way we can actually scalp the dose that we would like to deliver to the patient. Photon machines. The Linac that we talked about, there are a lot of different types of them. We support a multitude of them. We are not vendor dependent. We plan for a lot of the types and try to push each machine to its limit of how we can modulate that to achieve the best possible plan. Then if we go over to something that's proton therapy, maybe you've heard of. Protons are cool. If we look at this line here, it was the photons. They enter the body, and then they slow down, and then they deliver less and less dose. Protons, they are the opposite. The slower they move, the more irradiation they deliver. So when they enter the body, not that much dose delivered and they go slower and slower, and then they start to deliver a lot of dose until they put the end, delivers a lot, and then just stops. So you don't get an exit dose and hardly no entry dose. You can just deliver the radiation in the middle of the patient. To know why we don't all use this, we have to go back and watch our Linac. You can see here, this is the full radiation. This is the machine. This is what's needed for a hospital. Going over to the proton, this is what is needed. So here we have the patient. And over here we have a little linear accelerator that puts a lot of speed into the protons or carbons or other ions. And then they go into an accelerator that accelerates the ions to deliver them and bend them and get them into the gantry and off to the patient. I'm going to show you, this is and start off, we look at the accelerator, and then we're going to take a look at the gantry. So she's moving in here, and what you see here is the accelerator, and the red and yellow parts are magnets that focuses the beam. And this accelerator is a cyclotron. It takes the protons up to 3/4 of the speed of light. And then after that, this is 64 square meters in circumstance, and it weighs 600 tons. So this is the gantry. This is 600 tons. So what you can see here, what was the one that were rotating on the Linac. This is what's rotating on the proton machine. And that's the one that weighs 600 tons. And if we look at it, it rotates, and here it's actually around the full room. So the patient enters from the top and inside of the room, and then the gantry rotates around the full room. So it's money, I would say, is the cause. But it's very fun with proton parts is that as Linux, you can just buy off the shelf, more or less, whereas Proton clinics, you often build very specific. So we're often part already from the beginning when they build this system to make sure that we know what dose will be delivered, that they have some special things to shape the dose in their specific way. So we need to add support for that. So often we're part of the development of a new Proton center, which is very fun. There isn't that many Proton centers in the world. There's 82. United States are the biggest, and Japan is a lot. There's 24 in Sweden, no, in Europe, and Germany has 8, which is the biggest. We have one in Sweden, the Scandian Clinic in Uppsala, and they do not have our planning software. Yet. Now, they want it, but there is like the upphandling, whatever that's called. And what you can see here is like we are very large on the Protons, but what you can see here is like these are clinical, but we also have a lot of customers that not clinical yet, because it's a long process of being able to write the software for this clinic. This is our software back again. Once upon a time, we had Unix, Emacs, C++ only. Yeah. Now we're Windows. We're very much Windows. We wanted a familiar system. A lot of the planning systems for radiotherapy was very old. So there were a big drive against having something that looks shiny, nice, modern. So we have a VPF user interface. It has high abilities to shape the user interface the way you want it. The application layer is in C++. In C#. So all the parts that you see and can move and so forth is C#. Then we have computational services, C++, that you call. And we have a lot of computations on GPU. We recently have changed to CUDA. We had AMP before, so now we're NVIDIA only. CUDA had a lot of problems. We have your OpenGL graphics, full 3D rendering of everything. We are creating a Python scripting interface that both we and our customers can use to directly reach our model. And the database is on Microsoft SQL Server. So we work in Visual Studio, mostly. We use MATLAB on the research department to evaluate new optimization strategies and so forth. Our full database, we don't call it the database, we call it the domain model. We have like, if you have worked in 3D graph, it's a scene graph. Everything is built with an owner that depends on the other, and we have a lot of invalidation rules, a lot of validations. So all our security resides in our actual domain, which means that we can allow the scripting interface and the user interface to edit things in as they want, because we know that we keep the security in there. This also is, we do this to code generate everything. So the mapping to the database is directly code generated. So we have full access to how everything is stored. We don't send and take, we only store and save. And we have checksums to validate that what we actually wrote to the database the last time is the same that we read the next time. Use Microsoft Team Foundation Server. Going to move over to Git now. 2 million lines of C#, 1 million lines of C++ into one gigantic application. So we have an inbuilt build tool to build all our different projects one by one. Tests. We have 28,000 unit tests, 8,000 integration tests. Dose validation tests, that's when we compute for each machine that the dose will be delivered. A lot. Some of them we run before every check-in, since we deliver to the same code. Some we run as fast as we can. We have 2 gigantic servers with graphics cards that just runs our tests all of the time. Finally, view from our office. I like this. I have 1 foot in the research, 1 foot in the industry and market. Always strive to take those research results and try to push it into the software. You can work with cool machines. Now we're adding machine learning in this new version. It's always new cool things to add. And I like that when you work with software engineering, you're like, I would like to do something cool, maybe project a missile or something. But here you can do it, but actually do something good for people. I like that. Thanks.
Do you have any questions for Anna? Okay. Please join me in thanking Anna very much for the presentation. Thank you. So that is the end of today's Netnod technical meeting. Thank you very much for coming. We're ending a little bit early, so it gives you all a good chance to just do one final check of your DNS resolvers, because time is ticking. The buses will leave for the social at 5:45 sharp, just outside of the hotel. But for now, we would just like to thank you very much for coming, and thanks to the sponsors, Arista, Conapto, and Baffin Bay Networks. And we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.